Here in the National Gallery's Sainsbury wing, we're surrounded by religious paintings from the Renaissance. And in these modern galleries with their skylights and sophisticated lighting, they can be admired close up and in detail. Seeing these works in a gallery setting, it's easy to forget that they were made first and foremost as sacred objects for churches and were once part of a larger programme of liturgical decoration and furniture. In fact, many are fragments, pieces of altarpieces that once stood on or behind an altar, providing a visual focus for people's prayers and devotion. Perched on a hill above the city of Florence in Tuscany is the church of San Salvatore. The church once housed one of the National Gallery's Renaissance altarpieces, Zanobi Strozzi's Annunciation. Dating from the 1440s, the painting shows the Virgin Mary receiving news that she is to bear the Son of God. Behind Archangel Gabriel is a cluster of buildings set on a hill, probably meant to reflect San Salvatore itself. The subjects of altarpieces were often closely connected to the sites for which they were made.
Inside this church, the atmosphere is much as it would have been in the 15th century when the church was built. You can see, for example, the way the altarpieces hang above the altars in the side chapels, and the way the light filters in through both the chapel lights and above through the clerestory level. The light is much more dim, as we might see it in the gallery, for example. Here, the space is in a natural lighting, and that sort of is picked up by the flickering of the votive candles in front of the altars.
The word altar probably derives from the Latin adolere, meaning to burn. The Christian altar originated as a symbol of the table of the Last Supper and came to be used for the celebration of the Eucharist, commemorating Christ's sacrifice. From the early 13th century, candles were stipulated as an essential feature of an altar, along with a cross. As well as shedding light for reading the Missal, candles were also a sign of the light of faith, thereby figuratively and literally illuminating the words of the Bible. But an altar didn't have to have an altarpiece. This painting by the Master of St. Giles depicts the celebration of Mass, the central rite performed at the altar, and it shows how altarpieces were just one element of the ecclesiastical furnishings. They were accompanied by sculptures, crucifixes and reliquaries, and sometimes curtains would veil the altarpieces or the sanctuary. The curtains served both a practical and symbolic function, protecting the altarpiece from dust and also concealing and revealing it at certain moments of the liturgy. Although they were sometimes fashioned from metal or sculpted from wood or stone, altarpieces in Italy were usually painted on panel, as in this work by Sassetta. It shows the funeral of St. Francis of Assisi and records the way areas in front of or beneath altars often served as burial places for venerated figures. For the congregation in the church, altarpieces offered a tangible visual focus. They often depict the body or the suffering of Christ, in doing so evoking the mystery of transubstantiation, the belief that the Eucharistic bread and wine is transformed into the flesh and blood of Christ at the moment of consecration by the priest. From the early 14th century, Italian altarpieces were usually made up of a number of panels, a format known as a polyptych. This example was made in 1387 by the Florentine artist Niccolò di Pietro Gerini. It's currently here in the National Gallery's conservation studio being conserved. As in all polyptychs, panels of different shapes and sizes are united in an architectural Gothic-style frame. This one is a Victorian replica. But in the early 15th century, the polyptych format began to change with the emergence of the new Renaissance style. We find evidence of this in Strozzi's Annunciation, made for San Salvatore in Florence. It's a new style of altarpiece, known in Italian as a pala. While the earlier gilded polyptychs conjured up a separate heavenly realm, the pala altarpieces of the 15th century rooted these religious scenes in a credible world. We also see how painters began making spatially unified images, instead of separating the figures into different panels. They also gave their works a greater sense of naturalism through the treatment of light, the scale of the figures, the expressions, and the use of perspective. Whatever the style of the altarpiece, producing one was always a very close collaboration between a number of different parties. As we see in this altarpiece by Crivelli, 2 patrons were involved, and as is often the case, the painting holds the key to their identity. Directly beneath the Virgin and Child is the coat of arms of the Ottoni family from Atelica in the Marche region. Ranuzio Ottoni was a commander of the people's militia, a gonfaloniere, hence the presence of the patron saint of soldiers on the right, Sebastian, shown unusually as a chivalric knight rather than the usual tortured martyr, as we see him in the predella below. Opposite him is Saint Jerome, one of the 4 fathers of the church, holding a miniature church building. He represents the second stakeholder, the guardian of the local Franciscan convent, Fra Giorgio di Giacomo. If commissioning an altarpiece was a collaborative process, then producing one was even more of a team effort, involving numerous artists and craftsmen. The process began with the carpenters who carved the wooden structure, which often cost more than the artist's work. Once the carcass was ready, the artists prepared the wood with a chalk-like substance called gesso before the surfaces were gilded and finally painted. At times, due to the scale of the object, the process took place entirely in the church. But the question remains of how many of these altarpieces came to be broken up and their panels scattered around the world. Francesco Pezzolino's altarpiece for the Church of Santa Trinita in Pistoia is a case of a jigsaw puzzle that's been successfully reassembled. Painted in the mid-15th century, by the early 19th century, the altarpiece had been sawn into 5, possibly 6 pieces, and the predella divided into individual scenes. These were sold to private collectors. By today, all but one have been reunited. Quite a feat.
People often ask why altarpieces were removed from altars, and this sometimes happened early on in their history because fashions changed. So, for example, one might remove an old-fashioned polyptych and replace it with Renaissance palla. From the second half of the 18th century into the 19th century, many religious institutions were suppressed, for example, convents and monasteries. And in this case, the altarpieces were removed from altars and often dismembered or even butchered. And they entered the art market and they were dispersed around the world. And then they would enter collections such as the National Gallery.
Which brings us back to the jigsaw. Here in the National Gallery's conservation studios, we find one tool that helps curators and conservators in their task: X-rays. X-rays can reveal the most unexpected things. When this painting of the Last Supper by Ercole de Roberti was X-rayed, curators made a surprising discovery. Concealed behind the surface, they detected a keyhole, which suggests that the painting was once a cupboard door, the door to the tabernacle within a predella where the holy bread and wine were stored. All of these things contribute to solving the mystery of these prized works of art and once sacred devotional objects.
In the cases when we can solve these Renaissance jigsaw puzzles, it's immensely satisfying, and it really gives us a sense of the larger picture, both literally and figuratively. And we get a sense of the artistic context, but also the spiritual context that these were originally created for.
These outstanding works of art, fragments of Renaissance altarpieces, are an enduring testament to religious devotion in the 14th and 15th centuries, showing how art and craftsmanship were once at the service of the higher ideals of religion and devotion.